Well, we're picking up Paul's letter in the 5th chapter of Ephesians, and with 2 chapters to go, the remainder of the epistle is really going to focus on how we as children of God should walk. That's going to be the key focus, the theme of the final 2 chapters, how we should walk. So, beginning in verses 1 and 2 of Ephesians chapter 5, Paul says, therefore, everything he's been discussing before, therefore, be imitators of God as beloved children and walk in love, just as Messiah also loved you and gave himself up for us, an offering and a sacrifice to God as a fragrant aroma. So, be imitators of God. There's no possible way. So, to be imitators of God, there's no possible way that any of us can possibly be imitators of God unless we have God's Spirit indwelling in us. As we mature in our walk, we realize just how weak we are. Initially, early on perhaps in our salvation, we didn't really know just how weak we were. In fact, we probably thought we were pretty strong, but as time goes on, you mature in your faith, you really realize how weak we are and how our own strength falls short so often. So, therefore, be imitators of God as beloved children. And I've come to see this in my own life. As a child grows, as a son becomes a man, as a daughter becomes her own woman, as time goes on, we tend to become more like our parents. I think there's actually a commercial on TV about that, right? Or it's almost like a tongue-in-cheek kind of commercial where we wind up acting like our parents or talking like our parents. As a child grows, he or she will become more like his or her parents. So be imitators of God as beloved children. Imitate Him. As we grow in our faith, we'll become imitators of our Father. So how is this maturity achieved? Well, it's the straight edge of the Scriptures. You got to get into that Word. The Word is never going to change. It's the straight edge. I think of it like a level. Any of fellows, have you ever done any kind of woodworking or perhaps some carpentry, what have you? If you have a level, you put a level, perhaps like you could even try. You put a level against a wall. That level's not going to lie, and the level never changes. So if the liquid that is in that level doesn't rest in the middle as you put it against the wall, it's not the level's fault. The wall is off. So the level will tell you if something is straight or not. That Bible of ours will tell us what is right and what is wrong all the time, and it will never change. So we got to get into it. We got to read it. We must meditate on it. We must pray on these matters. You have to pray. All right, I've read this. I've studied it. Now, Lord, help me to apply it and help others as well. Help me, Lord, to crucify my desires. Greater is He that is in you, right? Control over what I want to do. Less of me and more of you. So he says, and walk in love. So grow, mature, beloved children, and walk in love just as Messiah also loved you. Walk in love, speaking the truth, avoiding lies, helping those in need, having words which edify and do not destroy, as you'll see in the coming verses, having compassion, always being ready to forgive and not holding on to a grudge, not holding on to any kind of bitterness. 1 John 1 verse 7, but if we walk in the light, as He Himself is in the light, we have fellowship with one another, and the blood of Yeshua, His Son, cleanses us from all sin. So love, and walk in love for our Father, for those in our families, for those in our congregational family, and even love for the enemies of Yeshua. There should be a love there where you know that there's a spirit in them that is lost. and is just a heartbeat away from eternal separation from God. Colossians 2:13 and 14 says, when you were dead in your transgressions and the uncircumcision of your flesh, he made you alive together with him, having forgiven us all our transgressions, having canceled out the certificate of debt, consisting of decrees against us, which was hostile to us, and he has taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross. Think of it this way. Yeshua's sacrifice on that cross on Calvary did not just have the potential to take away sin. It did take away sin. It didn't just have potential, it did it. And that is so important. Your redemption did not consist of Yeshua's work and your work. No, it's all him. It's all him. Tim Hegg in his commentary says, Yeshua's death did not make salvation possible. It made it inevitable for those whom he would save. And then he goes on. So, just as Messiah so loved you, gave himself up for us, that sacrifice at Calvary, an offering and a sacrifice to God. We've been discussing it even in our Hebrews lesson, right? The sacrificial system was always a shadow. It was never intended to be the end-all, be-all. It was important to God. He established it. With the destruction of the temple in 70, he ended it. It'll come back, but it was always a shadow. And he says this offering and a sacrifice to God as a fragrant aroma. Now this is interesting. In Leviticus 5, it speaks of different kinds of offerings. You have in Leviticus 5, you have a burnt offering, you have the meal offering, you have a peace offering, and those are all fragrant aromas. Only the guilt offering in that chapter is not stated as a fragrant aroma. Interesting. The guilt offering is not a fragrant aroma because the guilt offering was given because of a sin that was committed knowingly. You knew what you were doing. So you've asked for forgiveness. God has forgiven you. But to be accepted back into the community of faith, back into the assembly, a guilt offering was required. But you knew that something had to die for the act which you had committed. And the act that you had committed, you did it anyway. You did it anyway. There's going to be an offering that has to be given for the sin I'm about to commit, and I'm going to do it anyway. And that is not a fragrant aroma at all. So, man, that should give us reason to pause. God does not, when He saves us, He does not give us this blank check that we can sin any way that we want. And I think down through the years, unfortunately, evangelicalism and the church has done us wrong by, it's almost as if saying, well, it's all grace. It's all grace. Well, it's always been grace. But that just doesn't give us free rein to go ahead and just sin any way we want, thinking that God will wink at it. He never winks at sin. So we ought to remember Yeshua's sacrifice was an act of love for us as well as the Father. Continuing on to verses 3 and 4. But immorality or any impurity or greed must not even be named among you, as is proper among saints, and there must be no filthiness and silly talk or coarse jesting, which are not fitting but rather giving of thanks. So when he says not even be named among you, it's more like perhaps an idiom, which means not only must these things which he's about to explain, not only should they be a characterization of our lives, they shouldn't even be in our conversation. Not only in our lives, but not even in our conversations. The audience to which he's writing, these Ephesians, in a Greco-Roman culture, sexual deviancy was rampant. And that sexual deviancy was the cultural norm. And so he's going to start touching on some things here with that as a backdrop, is that sexual deviancy in that Greco-Roman world was the norm. So keep that in mind as we start to go through these various terms. He uses the word immorality. The Greek is porneia, of course, where we get pornography. That word describes prostitution, homosexuality, pedophilia. In other words, this is the behavior of pagans. Immorality, any impurity. So, as you're going to see in a deviant society, these prohibitions are going to be considered more acceptable and more widely practiced. Impurity, akatharsia, means that which is filthy, that which is dirty, that which undermines God's marriage. So we have immorality, porneia, impurity, filthy, dirty, which undermines what God has established from the very beginning with Adam and Eve. Okay? Greed. Remember, now, automatically you think greed is in perhaps like money or whatnot, but in the context here, he's talking about insatiable desires for sexual perversions. So we have immorality, we have impurity, we have greed. That lusting that I must have that which is not permissible. So he says, but immorality or any impurity or greed must not be even named among you. It shouldn't be characterized in our lives, shouldn't even be in our conversations, as is proper among the saints. As is proper among the saints. So, wow. I mean, we're now in a society and a culture, there's a growing acceptance to the very things that I've just mentioned to you. That which God sees as immoral, our society is saying it's acceptable. And unfortunately, and it's a terrible testimony to an unbelieving world, is when so many churches are capitulating to the LGBTQ movement. He says here, which is proper among the saints. The saint. When you hear that word saints, it means those who have been set apart. We're not to be delving into that kind of deviant lifestyle or promoting it even, like what the world is doing. He goes on, and there must be no filthiness and silly talk. Filthiness. In fact, ice cross. It's the only time you'll see it in the apostolic scriptures, right there in that verse, filthiness. It simply means something morally unacceptable, shameful, or some kind of vulgar speech. Filthiness. Silly talk. Well, in this context, we're not just talking about just joking or something, silly talk. We're talking about something that is sexually explicit joking. And this was the kind of behavior which oftentimes in that culture to which Paul is writing to and in, you had these Roman drinking parties where drunkenness was the norm, and this kind of behavior and this kind of speech was being used. He goes on, coarse jesting, veiled expressions which carry sexually explicit innuendos. All of these actions or thoughts, he's saying, are not fitting. They're not fitting for the saints. They're not fitting for children of God. This kind of behavior should not be indicative of someone who God has saved and brought into his family. So instead of these worldly behaviors, believers ought to be offering, as he says at the end of the verse, giving of thanks. Giving of thanks. Continuing verse number 5. For this you know with certainty, that no immoral or impure person or covetous man who is an idolater has an inheritance in the kingdom of Messiah and God. So, when someone is born from above. Because we toss the word Christian out around a lot. So, are you a Christian? He's a Christian, she's a Christian, everybody's a Christian. No, instead of that term, say, are you born again? Now, say, there's a lot of people, well, yeah, I'm an American, of course I'm a Christian. No. No, are you born again? Have you been born from above? Because when you're born from above, there's going to be a change in that life. You will see a change in that person's lifestyle. He says, for this you know with certainty. So in other words, be sure you all understand this. For this you know with certainty. And then he goes on to describe behavior which does not exhibit saving faith. And some of these terms are what he's already touched on in the previous verse. He says immoral, right? For this you know with certainty. There are no immoral. So same term as back in verse 3. Or impure person denotes all manner of worldly activities that would promote immorality. Impure. Covetous. A greediness, this unquenching desire to have really more than what you have already. Covetous. No immoral person, no impure person, no covetous person who is an idolater. Now, in that context, you're looking at someone who is so focused on themselves and on what their flesh wants and what they want, their own sexual desires, in this context, that, according to Paul, is idolatry. You have catapulted yourself and your flesh and your desires above God. And he says pretty much the same thing in Colossians 3 verse 5. He says, therefore, consider the members of your earthly body as dead to immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, greed, which amounts to idolatry. So he's saying the very same thing here as he had already said to the Colossian congregation, Colossae. And he says this kind of person has no inheritance in the kingdom of Messiah and God. So an inheritance, by using that word, it's proving to you and me that salvation is not something that you can earn, because an inheritance is not something you earn. An inheritance is given to you by someone's grace, right? Or you're a part of a family. And even though you might even be a family member to somebody, doesn't mean you're in their inheritance. So when you're in someone's inheritance, you have won their favor, and they're showing you grace by putting you in their inheritance. So this kind of person, this kind of idolatrous person, has no place, has no inheritance in that kingdom in which we belong. People who blend in with the assembly and who are not saved. Yeshua says this in Matthew 7 verse 23. I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice what? Lawlessness. Lawlessness. So they have no part in us. They never were a part of us. They are not a part of us. They have no inheritance. And then he uses an interesting phrase. In the kingdom of Messiah and God. Now that is rather interesting. You would think he would use one or the other, but he uses both. And there's a lot of opinion on this one. Here is, I think, a pretty good one. By using this term, the kingdom of Messiah and God, he's not only saying the kingdom in which we belong now, where Yeshua is on high. Okay, he reigns on high. He's our high priest. We are in his kingdom. It's a spiritual kingdom. But keep in mind, the kingdom of God is coming to this planet. And the king will rule from Jerusalem. So I think where he's going with this is kingdom of Messiah. So Messiah's position as it stands right now, as well as the position that Messiah will have when he returns. The kingdom of Messiah, now the kingdom of God which is to come. Or the world to come, the Olam Haba. Let's do verse 6. Let no one deceive you with empty words. For because of these things the wrath of God comes upon the sons of disobedience. Empty words. Words, thoughts, conversations which produce nothing which is edifying. Empty words. Don't be deceived by these empty words, because empty words are empty. They produce nothing for you. Let no one deceive you with empty words. For because of these things the wrath of God comes. So the wrath of God, meaning an eternal punishment of the wicked. Those who have been given the gospel, they heard the truth, they reject the truth. You reject the cross, you reject the blood, you reject His atonement. At that point, you are, as you will see, facing the wrath of God. These things, for because of these things, the wrath of God comes. Interesting word. Comes upon the sons of disobedience. So notice that's a present tense word. He doesn't say the wrath of God will come. No, it comes as in right now. So it's present tense. So we may not see it that way. But the sons of disobedience, those who are lost, are suffering God's punishment now. They're suffering God's punishment now, and they will suffer God's punishment. Sons of disobedience. Keep in mind, he's using these words for a purpose. Sons. The only way you can be a son is if what? You have a father. So if you're a son of disobedience, then your father is of disobedience. And their father is the father of disobedience, and their father is the father of lies. And they do their father's work. So he says the wrath of God comes, currently, present, upon the sons of disobedience. So it may seem to you and me, oftentimes we see what transpires, we see what the world is like, we see what we think is the wicked prospering. And we see that in the scriptures. You have the various prophets that struggle with that. Why do the wicked prosper? Why do they seem to have it so easy? They're living high and mighty. They never go hungry. They have everything handed to them. Why are they prospering and here we're struggling? And Paul is saying, no, not so fast. The wrath of God comes. So they are suffering now. It may not seem as if they're suffering, but they are suffering because they don't know God. They don't know God. And so they're really, they are slaves. They are slaves not only to their father, who is Satan, they're slaves to their own flesh. And that is miserable. That's a miserable life when you are a slave to your own desires. We, on the other hand, we've been chosen, we've been saved, we're servants of Messiah. We've been set free, and free indeed. So let's hit the pause on that one, and we'll pick it up next time with verse number 7.